Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues involving supply chains. To find out more, visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we're talking to Becky Rosdahl, Vice President for Trade Policy and International Affairs for the International Dairy Foods Association, about challenges and opportunities for the U.S. dairy supply chain. Becky, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you join us at Supply Chain University.
Thanks for having me.
So to start off, I was wondering whether you could give our viewers an overview of the U.S. dairy industry and how your industry's supply chains work.
Sure. Dairy has a really unique supply chain relative to some other agricultural commodities that it's evolved over hundreds of years here in the United States, actually. Obviously, it takes a good quantity of milk to manufacture dairy products, so U.S. dairy farmers frequently participate in cooperatives that pool their milk together and then sell that milk to processors according to prices established for that milk's particular end use, like cheese or yogurt or powder. So the system evolved this way because milk is not produced in every part of the country. And 100 years ago, it would have been much harder to get milk for dairy products if you lived in a place that didn't have dairy cows, like maybe Arkansas. And that natural segregation in the supply chain between the commodity in its raw form versus the commonly consumed form means supply chain issues like traceability from a shredded cheese, for instance, to farm of origin can be a little bit more challenging for our industry, but not impossible. So that regional basis for dairy production is something dairy has in common with some other agricultural commodities that need robust supply chains to transport and ultimately market our products, whether in the US or globally. And those robust supply chains are something we've been talking with our members a lot about lately.
And so let's turn now to the President's Executive Order on America's supply chains. And that came out on February 24th. And one of the purposes of the executive order is to help protect the United States from future shortages of critical imported components, like what we saw with the shortages of several essential goods needed to fight COVID-19, like PPE. But obviously, the executive order, the scope goes, beyond that as well. How do you think the executive order fits into the dairy industry's overall
administration and really start thinking big and thinking long term about what changes we might need to consider to better position U.S. competitiveness and maintain food security. We're very supportive of the administration's decision to take a deeper dive into some of the supply chain issues we've been experiencing over the past year or so. And we hope that supply chain resiliency remains a priority in the future as well. The executive order's outcome, of course, remains to be seen as we work with regulatory agencies on their notices for public comment, but we're excited by the possibilities that lie ahead through this process. Imagine, for example, if this process changed the way how we think about food packaging and labeling works, and if that were to result in consumers having the option to purchase parceled out bulk products that would otherwise go to waste in the event of more food service closures. That's just one outcome that could benefit millions. So what else might we be able to collectively achieve through this process?
Yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, this is a really great opportunity just from my time working on, supply chain issues at Commerce. Whenever a supply chain issue would come up, we would get tagged and we'd have to go to the White House and get their attention and stand up an interagency body to deal with the issue, and then we disband until the next crisis came up, 6 months later or a year later. So it really is a huge opportunity, but obviously it's challenging to come up with a whole of government policy and make sure you get the right, private sector stakeholders in the room. And I love your example about, the packaging and labeling issues and making sure that consumers have that option. And I think that goes to, how can we use technology in the supply chain in order to help create that market? And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But in terms of, your engagement with the administration on the executive order, and there's a section of the executive order that deals specifically with, supply chains for agricultural commodities and food products. What do you think that IDFA is going to emphasize about your supply chains, and what do you see as potential opportunities in the executive order, and what do you see as potential challenges and risks?
Yeah, we're still in active discussions with some of our member companies about what priorities we'll put forward, but it's really clear to us that the administration is thinking differently about supply chain, probably in much broader terms than perhaps has been historically the case. And so we're trying to also think differently about supply chains. The traditional sense of a supply chain is the truck delivers the product from a facility to a retailer. And clearly, the opportunity exists now to engage the administration in a much broader and more innovative sense, because that's just not the supply chain that exists for our members anymore either. So as an example, some of the questions we're discussing with our members companies are whether we have enough regulatory flexibility to allow for supply chain resilience. In the example of using bulk food service products for retail, for example, would labeling laws need to evolve? Or another example would be that FDA hasn't finalized an update to the U.S. yogurt standards that were written in the 80s. But ingredient technologies have evolved over time with innovation. So how could we expect our yogurt producers to be able to find alternative ingredients in the event of uncertainty within their procurement sources if they're limited to concepts from 40 years ago? Another example might be that we're consuming less dairy products than we produce in the United States. So we've had some discussions as to whether supply chain resiliency is really just all about trade. If we're not maintaining competitive exports, a resilient supply chain domestically won't be enough to absorb our foreign losses, and resiliency is a domestic and trade issue in that case. Similarly, domestic losses can't always be simply redirected to foreign markets, depending on whether the product is consumer facing or bulk or even compliant with that market, even if they're the exact same product. It's just not how our supply chains work. It's not how trade works. So all this has led to a lot of other discussions about what the government can do to support our trade, whether we need to spend additional time educating our government colleagues about how our supply chains function to get there. This is a long way of saying we're coming around to this administration's way of thinking that maybe supply chain resiliency encompasses our roads, our ports, our standards, our environment, our exports, and much more. And that we view these kinds of priorities as both challenges and risks, but in both cases necessary to consider for the future growth of our industry.
Yeah, I think they're definitely thinking broader. Not just transport and logistics, but competitiveness. It's also something that everyone's focused on. When I used to raise chassis and container availability issues, people would want to go the other way, and now those are some of the big issues that everyone's focused on, which is it's about time. I also think that in terms of regulatory flexibility, I think this actually is a good time for what you're talking about. I know that in some of the earliest statements from the new administration, they're really re-envisioning the role of OMB, specifically my old office and the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs, which oversees the regulatory process, as being more proactive in identifying potential rules that would increase benefits, and that of course could include benefits to producers, benefits to consumers, and I think White House, USDA should be open to that. Definitely seems like there's an opportunity there. And to your last point about supply chain resiliency going beyond physical infrastructure. I mean, supply chain visibility, and that a lot of that's going to be a technology issue, and you need that to improve supply chain resiliency. And so it seems like that's an area where the administration could help in making sure that infrastructure doesn't and the Hill as well, that it goes beyond physical infrastructure to digital infrastructure. And speaking of supply chain disruption, obviously the dairy industry was not immune to the disruptions caused by COVID. And I'm wondering whether you can talk about some of the challenges that the industry faced from the pandemic. What's the current state of play on container and truck availability, and whether you have any suggestions for the administration to address the issue.
Yeah, we were not immune, and like many others in agriculture, we've been really hurting lately. For dairy, it's not just a matter of container availability or of the pandemic displacing food service outlets domestically. What started with a massive influx in online shopping and consequently imports from overseas somehow ballooned into ports becoming overwhelmed, Chinese shippers returning with empty containers back to Asia, um, in order to service Asian exports quicker. That compounded quickly downchain to facilities seeking to export being unable to get truckers who could get their products into the port for export promptly, or if they could, are being told to wait 6 weeks or more for an export vessel booking. That delay has led to rail sightings filling for weeks on end across the middle of the country, with products simply sitting and waiting for a green light to finally head to the coast. These circumstances have also created complexities for our companies who import. They say they have importing vessels sit at anchor for weeks outside the port while they wait for a terminal to become available for offloading. And even then, they might only receive a couple hours notice to actually offload the vessel, which is really hard to swing when your truck drivers for offloading the goods are stuck in a line of trucks to access the port that's several hours long, if you even have a truck driver available. So
Right.
if you add to all this the fact that some ports are charging demurrage for containers waiting for a departing vessel, and some carriers are exporting goods that are they're offloading agricultural goods that are perceived to be not as high value. Plus the labor restrictions COVID has created for port workers, the situation is beyond frustrating for our members, and they've been telling me this week in particular that they expect it to get much worse before it gets better as the truck to driver ratio continues to get worse. We have one of our companies that's even calculated they're spending about $1 million a month in rerouting fees, waiting, and just increased costs of procuring vessels and drivers. So our hope is that anytime any of these kinds of situations arise, small exporters having to beg large exporters for vessel space, that red flags would go up with the administration, that it's really, really time to think very differently about these issues. They aren't just something where we need a new demurrage rule from the Federal Maritime Commission. We need innovative interagency brainstorming. I mean, you and I have talked about the fact that we see that from both of our former roles. Why isn't USTR involved in the trade aspects of carriers returning to Asia empty, and how Chinese-owned carriers are treating our exports? Why aren't there appointed industry advisors who can regularly collaborate with a transparent interagency working group and share what they're seeing on the ground? Why does it seem like each agency is just looking at the Department of Transportation for answers when the issues we're seeing on the ground are not solely under their purview, and when it impacts so many different commodities under different agencies' jurisdictions? One congressional office recently asked me why we don't just start making more containers if we need more containers. But we need to think bigger than that. Our supply chain is complex, so these solutions need to be complex as well.
Yeah, I mean, everything in the supply chain is interconnected. And so if you have an issue in one part of the chain, eventually it's going to affect everything else. And I think your example just highlights that, perfectly. Um, and again, I agree. And, I was at USTR for a long time, as were you. And traditionally they haven't been involved. I think, and it's a small agency, but I do think that, without speaking for Ambassador Tai, I get the sense that she's open to thinking big and thinking about innovating and connecting trade policy with competitiveness and supply chain. And so I'm wondering whether they might actually be open to that. And totally agree with you that this is an interagency issue. And based on my experience working on this, I mean, I think, in the government, we probably need a permanent White House supply chain office, either a new one or maybe within an existing component like NSC or NEC to oversee it. As you noted, it's traditionally viewed as a transportation issue, but it's clear it's much larger than that. The executive order reflects that. And, I like the idea of having a mechanism where, USDA can weigh in on issues involving commerce and trade in food and ag products, but with the benefit of input from other agencies with their equities, and also private sector supply chain experts that really know how those supply chains work and can provide that information and also real time, intel. Because as you know, I mean, these are very, complex issues. And I guess, part of the reasoning behind the executive order is to ensure that the United States is not caught, flat-footed whenever the next big unknown happens. And so I guess, what do you think can be done to ensure that there's greater resilience to future supply chain disruptions, while at the same time we're protecting the competitiveness of the U.S. dairy industry?
Yeah, well, I hate to just tell you again, that's something we're talking with our member companies about, but it really is. I mean, these are exactly the kinds of discussions that we've been having with our member companies, and that we were having before COVID. We already felt like our industry is in a position of sort of needing to look ahead and consider what future scenarios might exist for our industry. And COVID has only heightened that sense that now is the time to prepare for all eventualities, not just in supply chain resiliency, but across the board. So we actually have a task force that's been evaluating different scenarios and what necessary changes we might need to make to protect ourselves for those eventualities. And it's been a really great process that's resulted in not only a lot of great discussion and thoughts, but significant access that shows us we need to double down. We've identified certain areas like innovation growth, pricing, regulatory flexibility, and sustainability as areas that could be a gamble to work on or hard to advance, but are likely really what we need to do and going to help us in the long term when, not if, the next big unknown happens.
Right.
So I think these are areas that are a little unique to our industry, to the dairy industry, and where we're at now, and where we need to be. Not necessarily staple areas applicable to industry, but any industry, but a great place to start.
Yeah, as we were talking about earlier, I mean, a lot of these issues are not just going to pertain to the dairy industry, but to food and ag production writ large. Thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Look forward to continuing the discussion as the administration's implementation of the EO unfolds, and as you come up with policy prescriptions for government, and as things move forward. I'd love to have another discussion about that at some point, if you're willing. That would be great.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And it's going to take more brains than just ours to solve it. So we're looking forward to collaborating.
Great. And thanks again for your thought leadership on this. And that's it for this edition of Supply Chain University. You can find this and all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.